everybody and their dog is probably kicked around the tariff talks, the repercussions thereof. They're going to get refunds. They're not going to get refunds. The court's going to go one way or the other. This is going to be a good discussion. We have somebody on hand that's been on the show before, and he always has some great, stimulating discussion, I guess, Eric. Eric Hargraves, it's like it's one of those things that you definitely are one of the sharper tools in the shed, and I love getting to talk with you. But Lalo and I enjoy our conversation. So this is going to be more of a kind of a roundtable discussion and give people something to think about, right?
Andy, every time you do an introduction for me, you make me blush. So I'm glad not all of this is always on video. But yeah, I'm excited to talk about it today. It's always a fun time with you guys. So thanks for having me on.
You bet. Lalo, I'll tell you, why don't you can kick us off with some of this, but I mean, there's been some interesting things. There's been so many things in the courts. Let me throw it to you to let you kind of start us off with kind of where we want to take the conversation today.
Yeah. Well, I had a conversation with Eric and decided let's go ahead and record this for the podcast, but it's pretty much, again, the Supreme Court hearings were a couple of weeks ago, so obviously nothing has been handed down as of today. There have been, and like you said, Andy, there have been several folks, that make comments or that are speculating. Hey, let's do this. This may happen. This may happen. Which is pretty good. And last week we had a few folks on our show who did the same. So we had the discussion with Eric, and he's like, "Well, I'm starting to see some frameworks being shaped here in anticipation of maybe IEEPA getting revoked, and not that IEEPA will be revoked, but the IEEPA tariffs that were imposed will get revoked. IEEPA will always be around, or should be around anyway, because the president does need that power to be able to do that in an emergency. But anyway, so Eric brought up quite a few other interesting items. So I said, Eric, let's get on the podcast. So here we are. Eric, thanks for joining us again. I mean, you're always a trooper, and you always come on and enlighten us with the information that you have from your business. Well, the business that you do through your firm.
Thanks for having me. I just I found it really interesting listening to the oral arguments earlier this month. It's clearly the tone was skeptical, right? Skeptical of how far we went with tariff impositions using the IEEPA statute. You said it well. IEEPA is not going away. International Emergency Economic Powers Act is on the books. It's going to remain on the books. The question is, how much authority does that give the president to impose tariffs that are this broad and sweeping? Are the tariffs actually a tax on consumers? We're really kind of trying to refine the definitions, and the outcome of this got me trying to read tea leaves, to be honest. And I'm trying to read between the lines on what's being said, what was said in the oral arguments, the actions of the administration. And I went back and looked at quite a few leading indicators from this past year. And we've had an increase in Section 232 investigations and tariff impositions, right? Let's recount some of them. We've got steel, aluminum, copper. We've had lumber and derivative products. We've had the list of derivative products being imposed for steel and aluminum tariffs. We've had heavy-duty vehicles, automotive tariffs. We've had investigations into pharma, medical devices, and robotics, all under Section 232. The difference here is that when you look at the IEEPA tariffs and how they were imposed, going back to Liberation Day, those were country-specific, country of origin specific, right? And they were broad, sweeping, based on an emergency that was declared related to our trade deficit with global trade deficit. But Section 232 deals with national security interests, and therefore is enforced by a list of tariff codes that are impacted. Chapter 73 and 76, steel and aluminum, then all the derivative HTS codes that were listed. We essentially get these executive orders followed by Federal Register notices and then customs guidance, CSMS messages about a list of tariff codes impacted by an imposition. So it's almost like industry sectors that are being impacted versus origin nations that are being impacted. And I thought, wow, this is interesting. Section 301, going back to 2018, is really the same thing. You have 4 lists of tariff codes to which these apply, right? Anywhere from 7.5% all the way up to 100% tariffs on Section 301 goods originating in China. Again, that's kind of the blend of country of origin and industry sectors or product sectors that are impacted by the tariff impositions. And so as we fast forward to where we are today, are we seeing, and this is a question, I'm not saying this is what's happening, I'm just recklessly speculating on your podcast that we're seeing a shift from origin targeted tariffs to sectoral tariffs, meaning product sectors, industry sectors being influenced by the tariff impositions going forward. Then this idea was reinforced even after the oral arguments were heard, where we now saw a few announcements by the administration and the Commerce Department of certain exclusions that are available. We just heard this past weekend, right, on the 14th, last Friday, that certain agriculture products are now exempt from the reciprocal tariffs, coffee and so forth. We heard quite a few ag products that, quite frankly, when you look at consumer price inflation in the index, you've got pretty moderate inflation, but in some of the core CPI, like when you go to the grocery store, things are certainly more expensive. And so getting these exemptions now from the reciprocal tariffs on these core agriculture products is going to sort of flatten out some of that inflationary pressure we all feel in our wallets when we go shopping every day. Then I started thinking about, well, there's also this sort of weird rumor that the president put out that he was going to give tariff dividends, like $2,000 dividends, because we took in all this money from the tariff impositions, and we're going to give it back to consumers to kind of stem or stimulate the economy, stem inflation or stimulate the economy. And while no law has actually been placed, it was interesting to me that we're starting to see sort of a more targeted approach to how we're going to deal with both tariff revenue and products being impacted by the tariffs. Another example would be that when we look more closely at the bilateral trade deals that are being struck, or trade frameworks, really, they're not full-fledged free trade agreements or reciprocal tariff agreements. They're not preferential trade agreements as we would historically think about them, but they are frameworks. There are specific carve-outs for specific industry sectors and lists of tariff codes that are going to be impacted. So if IEEPA gets rescinded, the tariffs get rescinded, then we're going to see a pivot to another statute that gives the president authority and autonomy to impose tariffs that he clearly has the right to use to impose tariffs. But those are, generally speaking, more product specific or sectoral in nature, where there's a list of tariffs to which there's a list of tariff codes to which these impositions apply. And on the reciprocal end of that, or the facilitation end, exports are also getting preferential treatment into foreign markets. And that requires us to sort of list out the product sectors that are going to receive preferential treatment into destination markets overseas. And so I'm seeing this sort of narrowing of the spear, right, towards certain product sectors that are being impacted more than others. And that might be the path forward.
All right. Hey, Eric, let's jump in here and kind of level set with everybody just to remind us, like they hear of IEEPA and all that. So IEEPA is, and I'm sitting there Googling it so I can read it correctly here, International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And it was a law that was enacted in 1977 that grants the president broad authority to regulate international commerce and financial transactions after declaring a national emergency in response to an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security, foreign policy, or economy of the United States. Okay, so there's that. And traditionally, tariffs have not been part of that, enacting tariffs on some of those things. Now, we've also had a scenario here, you've mentioned two things, where the 301s and 232s. All right. The 301 tariffs were put in predominantly to deal with China. The 232s were done in an effort to try and revive the U.S. steel industry, steel and aluminum and those kinds of things. Now, whether you agree with them or not, that's my understanding is that was what was implemented. And now the question is, too, even in today's world, well, do we still need the tooths on the steel and aluminum? China's still doubling down on that, so I can see that. But there's that. Now, the other part of this, though, that is in Trump's issue now, and this is where I've always said this, is that U.S. goods have not been treated fairly around the world. And I say that from a standpoint that there has either been higher tariffs on U.S. goods or additional bureaucracy and permits and everything else that have gone on for U.S. goods to go into countries. We import millions of pounds and millions of dollars coming back. So the point being is, out of all that, what does all of those things say? There's an imbalance here. It's not equal trading. And that's where I think Trump is trying to take it on. Now, here's what I find interesting. So I'd love to get your perspective on this. Is there's been huge criticism of Trump in the way he's using the tariffs to negotiate. He's using the provision, what he feels he has under IEEPA, and the courts will decide whether he does or he doesn't. But the whole thing is, he can't do that. He shouldn't do that. Well, status quo hasn't done jack, but that's where it is. I'm sick and tired of hearing, well, you got to do it this way or that way. The thing that gets me is we've not seen results. There's been talk, and then now all of a sudden there's action. So these countries have been coming to the table and negotiating some things to at least now we're looking at a more fair economic trade with some of these countries. We still have to compete on price, cycle times, quality, transit time, all that kind of stuff. But to that point, what do you think as far as trying to get results to level the playing field? Because U.S. exports have taken it in the shorts at the expense of the export expense, but to get cheaper imports, I guess.
I guess that's what you meant about sectoral, like creating tariffs by sector versus by country. Because, I mean, quite frankly, imposing a high tariff on the whole country is counterproductive in that we need some of their stuff, like rare earths. We need things that we just can't produce here, or we don't have the natural resources for. So what you're saying was that it's obvious that obviously is not working, because I mean now he's making exemptions for some products, like you said, like coffee. Like you can't put
Thank God.
Yeah, exactly. So you can't put a super high tariff on coffee coming from Colombia because you're pissed off at Colombia. I'm sorry, not coffee, on everything globally coming from Colombia. If you're being selective, I guess that makes sense. That's what you were heading towards on your theory. Anyway, it's a theory. Remember, everyone, this is Eric's theory, and not necessarily that's what's happening.
I'm saying that the administration is definitively moving away from broad country of origin based, trade deficit rebalancing. That's going to happen. I'm saying that if the tariff impositions that were imposed using the IEEPA statute go away, and the Supreme Court agrees with the two lower courts, tariffs are going to remain a key economic policy driver for this administration. They are going to pick another statute that clearly authorizes him to impose tariffs, like 232, 301, 122, perhaps 338. And those often require a bit more targeted approach. And there are certain requirements that keep Congress in the mix, as in with Section 232, an investigation has to be conducted by the Commerce Department that shows Congress the risk to national security. With 301, an investigation has to be administered by the USTR that gives Congress insight into the unfair trade practices of another nation, right? That is causing us a struggle, that's creating a trade imbalance. So, Andy, you said a lot, and I'm going to try to maybe give some historical context into why the imbalances exist, the focus on China in the first Trump administration, and now what we're seeing more broadly in the second Trump administration. The trade imbalances have existed for a very long time. That's well documented and really dates back to post-World War II. And you go back to 1947 and the meeting in Geneva, I think it was, for the general agreements on tariffs and trade, where the United States agreed to an asymmetrical reciprocity in lowering of tariffs. Because at the time, the United States had very high tariffs, right? And we agreed to lower them, and we lowered ours more than Europe lowered theirs under the General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade, because we understood that having a healthy Europe post-World War II gives us the ability to export more. So we needed a healthy Europe post-World War II. We wanted to be able to give them the ability to export goods into the United States and rebuild their economy, because that would enable us to sell more to them once their economy stabilized again. And when you put that in conjunction with the Marshall Plan to help rebuild Europe, it is one of the reasons that we both grew together post-World War II in the rebuilding effort. And the economies of Europe and the United States were able to thrive. And then in post-Cold War, where globalization really took off, it helped, the rising tide lifts all boats. And everybody did really well for a long period of time. Introduced China being admitted to the World Trade Organization in, I think, 2001. And we thought that bringing them into this inclusive environment would fix, for lack of a better term, some of their imperialistic efforts worldwide. And that didn't really happen, right? You mentioned forced labor. That's the new, it's not new, it's been around a very long time, but it's a popular issue to discuss in global trade right now is the UFLPA, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And it is highlighting a very real need and an ethical and moral need and a noble cause in global society. And
to your point, and let me just say this, and jumping in there, as we were going through, we were hoping at the time, I remember when China became part of the WTO, hence the World Trade Organization, it was with the idea it was a communist country, and it was hoping to, if you will, help provide more capitalist type methodologies in the economy into their country and whatnot is one thing. But the thing that I think that over those years, the thing that has not happened, there's two major entities that have not held them, China, accountable. One is the World Trade Organization itself, because to become a member, this is one of the things way back, Larry Hansen and I had a good discussion on, is to become a member of the World Trade Organization, you were to look at it from a standpoint where you were to open up your markets and you were trying to look at lowering your tariffs, hopefully into a free trade arrangement. China did not do either. If they opened them up, they kept these, extraordinarily high tariffs and all that. So to do business in China has not been easy. That's one. So the WTO is one entity that should have said, hey, wait a minute, you're not adhering to the rules. Second is the United Nations and the use of forced labor and all that. And there's all been this talk, and yet absolutely no action, So that's where I have the issues that where we're at today is somebody's finally standing up trying to do something. But the point being is it's not just the U.S. China's played hardball with the entire world. And that's where I'm still struggling when people are trying to wrestle with this. And then here the U.S. and to your point, healthy Europe back in the day, yes, you can exchange things back and forth, and that's great. Well, I have to say then a healthy U.S., because our manufacturing has been decimated, and trying to rebuild that with a healthy economy, then you have more parties to exchange raw goods, finished goods, semi-finished,
Yeah. I think you're on to something there, Andy, that's really interesting to think about. With China getting market access across the world, they built a very robust manufacturing industrial complex for all types of goods, industrial, consumer, everything. And China, by and large, over the last several decades, has proven to be somewhat imperialistic. And I think we can all agree that empires are generally bad for the world, right? It leads to more forced labor, more imprisonment, it's generally bad, right? So I think somebody had to do something about the manipulation of trade and intentionally undervaluing goods to gain market share in the rest of the world, which was what China has been doing for a while, using forced labor to artificially lower the cost of goods for exports, making a non-competitive environment, a non-market driven economy, pushing goods westward. And then they kind of built their whole Belt and Road Initiative to further their influence in the world and making countries completely dependent upon their industrial complex. And I think what has happened in recent years is that's been called out. And it's a bipartisan issue. It is not Republican or Democrat. I mean,
Yeah,
we saw
right.
the UFLPA, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, had wide bipartisan support. And I think we're trying to do some good in the world. And I think going back to the first Trump administration, when the Section 301 tariffs that were imposed on China and those 4 lists of tariff codes came out, it also had bipartisan support. But that was the first, like, hey, we're going to do something about this imperialistic westward push for dominance by China's economic policy and kind of manipulating currency values and using forced labor and having unfair subsidies to lower the value of goods being exported. I think that goes all the way back to the first Trump administration. Now where we're at is we basically looked at the entire world and said, we've all become slightly dependent upon one another, but at what level are we going to be able to put enough pressure on China to fix some of these issues? And that's where we've seen this perhaps excessive use of IEEPA. The Supreme Court is not determining whether or not the president can negotiate deals or impose trade policy. They're saying, to what extent is this authority? And if you listened to the oral arguments, there was a lot of time spent on the quote unquote regulate importation, which is under IEEPA. The president has the authority to regulate importation in an emergency. Mm-hmm. And the emergency that was declared was a persistent trade deficit. And what does regulate importation mean? Certainly tariffs are a way we can regulate importation. It is a clearly defined trade remedy. Mm-hmm. We've used it in the past. We haven't used IEEPA in the past for this, but we've used tariffs to regulate importation. And I think, to what extent are there limits to that? How far does that go? Is, I think, the question that's being asked of the Supreme Court to decide. And if they say all of these have to be revoked and he's going to have to pivot to another statute, then he will. What I'm seeing is, I think they took a step back and looked at the forest through the trees, and they saw that they might need to introduce additional investigations, and those started way earlier this year. I mean, there are open Section 232 investigations on pharmaceuticals, medical devices, robotics, lots of different product sectors, industry sectors. And
well,
so
there's
I'm
an increase in
myself,
exams too, it appears, from customs on a lot of fronts, is what I'm hearing in the industry.
And if you look at the trade deals, they kind of support this idea as well, that we're kind of narrowing the tip of the spear. We're sharpening the tip of the spear on certain product sectors and certain lists. If you look at the annexes that are published with some of these executive orders and Federal Register notices, it's very clear some of the product sectors that are being impacted the most. And perhaps that's the path forward. And we're going to get, which I would welcome as sort of somebody who wants more clarity, because then we're sort of getting back to a rules-based system where the tariffs are being applied to specific products at specific rates, perhaps for a specific amount of time. And I think that gives compliance professionals, that gives supply chain practitioners and managers clarity on how to build networks of supply that can satisfy demand. Because that's really what this is. It's supply and demand. And what's the calculus of the landed cost for that supply to satisfy the demand? And we need some clarity around that. I think we're going to get it at some point in 2026 when the dust settles.
Well, I will say that to your point, it's that as we're going through this, there's, at this point, different strategies, things have gone on. I mean, we're not even a full year into Trump's second administration. I mean, it's been a year since the election, and there's been so much that's gone on. I mean, aside from the tariff situations and the trade, then you have the trade deals. You also have some of the geopolitical issues going on. Obviously the stopping of some of the conflicts out there. What Trump had used was using the economic carrot, if you will, of trade deals to try and like, look, guys, stop this, and we can, help improve life in both of your countries and with the U.S. and all that. I think all that's fine, well and good. It just seems like everybody seems to want to fight every single thing because the status quo has been destroyed.
Yeah.
There is not.
I think.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the status quo under the World Trade Organization and for the past several decades has been sort of free market access, right? Globalization. That's the status quo. And what we're seeing now, here's a helpful way to think of it. As I was thinking about this today, and I was presenting on a panel earlier this morning as well, think of the recent tariff impositions, whether that's Section 301, 232, IEEPA, as a wall of restriction, right? Think of it as closing the border a little bit on certain countries and certain products. Now what we're seeing kind of, not quite a year into this administration is that we are now opening corridors of trade facilitation in that wall. We put up a big wall called IEEPA, reciprocal tariffs. And now we're opening corridors of trade facilitation in that wall where you can access the markets both ways. They can access the United States and we can access their markets.
And see that right there, that second part is so that's what people have not seen yet. It takes time to get those exports, if you will, and those markets, opening up those markets and all that to get going.
We're seeing those corridors be opened in the form of exemptions, exclusions. We're seeing other opportunities, carve-outs in the bilateral trade deals for certain product sectors to be facilitated more. And I think that's logical and reasonable. I mean, when you look at another country and what their industrial base can supply the United States, and you look at what our industrial base can supply them, going back to Lalo's point earlier, we're going to have some trade facilitation corridors with China. We just saw them have a healthy conversation, and we cannot, in our soil, mine a lot of the rare earth minerals that we need. We have to trade. And so we're going to open up some corridors for trade facilitation and this big wall that we put up for restriction of certain goods and market access. And I think, Andy, to go back to your point of why was this wall built, and we've got Section 301 and 232, you were talking a lot about steel and aluminum and all these things. The reality is Section 232 is directly relatable to national security. So when we see these high tariff impositions on steel, aluminum, copper, pharmaceuticals, and so forth, that wall is being put up because if we find ourselves in a military conflict where our national security is at risk, we don't want to have to be reliant on a third country to supply our steel or aluminum for our defense industrial base to be able to protect itself, or for our citizens to be able to get the medication they need. And so putting up some barriers with tariffs so that we don't completely hollow out our domestic industry of these key product sectors is important. I think somewhat reasonable, as long as we can still create an environment where companies can thrive and jobs can be created.
And Lalo, you were talking about earlier, you mentioned the rare earth minerals. I know there was an agreement recently with Australia. The Prime Minister of Australia had come over. And the interesting thing is that China has strategically, China does not have a whole lot of rare minerals in their country, but they process about 90% of all rare earth minerals that have been mined around the world. And so they have control of that. I didn't realize that, but one of the things, what that does is that then China has this stronghold of the rare earth minerals. And so Australia, we just got a trade agreement there. One of the things that I see as an opportunity is Australia has not been mining those rare earth minerals. The country has a lot of them. Well, mining companies right now are going to be getting set up and getting things going in Australia. I think, believe it or not, Japan has some. That there was a trade agreement, and part of that was with being able to get some of those minerals out of Japan. So what I see is this dependency on China is being broken, or the foundation of things that China had built their economy on being so dominant is now has cracks in it. But we still have to go through and say, okay, let's open up these markets in a fair trade type thing. That's where I see some of this coming back and forth. The one thing that I'll say, though, be it the 301s, the 2s, be it the reciprocal tariffs, tariffs generally are used to modify the behavior of a country from a trade perspective. And with that, the question also comes into play is, how long are you looking? Do you have an exit strategy on some of this? Or what are the key elements of what you need to try and negotiate what you're trying to accomplish in your negotiations to then say, okay, now we can lower them or go duty free or whatever the case may be. And so I find it interesting on some of that to say that, obviously we're not privy to some of that. And that's some of the frustration in just the importing and exporting communities. Like, where the heck is this? Does this end, or do we go somewhere, or what?
And I think we're going to get some clarity in 26. I think we're already starting to see a bit of clarity with the bilateral trade deals and some of the oral arguments that were presented to the Supreme Court. It's starting to look more concrete. I don't think it's concrete enough yet for corporations to make big financial investments, like not making huge CapEx expenditures yet, but it's going to come. We'll get some clarity. And at the end of the day, it's likely that the effective tariff rate in the United States goes up to about 15% versus what it used to be, which was single digits by and large. And I think our consumers can likely afford to pay that so long as they still have good paying jobs and inflation doesn't get out of whack and we control some of the other issues that are impacting inflation, like taxes and energy costs. And we got the extension of tax credits and breaks in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And we also got, energy costs being lowered by and large. And I think that helps us keep more of our money. So if we have to pay a little bit more for some of the consumer products that we like to buy that are being tariffed at a higher rate, we could likely afford to do that. But let's see what shakes out. I think the beginning of 26 in particular, is going to be a really fun year. But we also have the USMCA up for its review and renegotiation in 2026. And we'll see how that shakes out as well.
Yeah, there's been a lot on USMCA, and I think we just had a show with Kiko on there talking about that. Then if you look back in history, and that's something that I think the average American citizen is looking forward to saying, we're needing a shot in the arm, and things are happening. It's taken time to transition from past policies to the new ones.
And thinking about all of this, going back to the analogy of having this tariff wall that was erected, and now we're seeing sort of certain corridors open up to facilitate trade through exemptions and exclusions, bilateral trade deals. We even saw in the auto industry, offset credits for component parts, right? For the automobile manufacturers to be able to kind of reduce the burden of the tariff on that particular sector. It's clear to me that we currently have opportunities for a sectoral-based tariff regime alongside right now country of origin-based tariffs. But if IEEPA tariffs are ruled unlawful, then we're going to see this pivot to another statute. I've got maybe 3 practical takeaways where you can take advantage of some of these corridors of facilitation that are opening. The first is map your exposure to the current tariff regime, but also to the preferential treatment that's available to you now based on the types of products that you're importing. because there's some preferential treatment that removes the reciprocal tariffs that kind of mitigates the risk of increasing the cost. So make sure you're mapping that exposure. Prepare for legacy frameworks to not necessarily go away, but to be altered. By that, I mean USMCA is up for renegotiation. We're seeing some communication in the recent trade deals that were struck with Guatemala, Ecuador, El Salvador, Argentina, that for Guatemala and El Salvador, certain CAFTA DR exemptions now exist where the reciprocal tariffs do not apply to certain products. So be ready and be prepared to be able to map your risk, but also your preferential treatment in legacy trade frameworks that are going to be coming down the pike. And lastly, make sure that you are not implementing any huge supply chain shifts in your network based on tweets or Truth Social posts. Follow the official Federal Register notice, followed by customs guidance. And in order to be prepared, you need to be modeling those scenarios ahead of time based on what's coming out and the information that we're getting from the administration and from foreign nations on trade deals that are occurring. Make sure you're modeling different scenarios and the calculus on your landed cost so that when we do have something official, when the Federal Register notice is published and we get customs guidance on enforcement, that we can quickly pivot to the best cost country sourcing scenarios for your organization.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, Eric, thank you so much for the discussion. I mean, again, this is one of those folks that's just kind of a round table, having a cup of coffee or whatever and having a good discussion. What do you think and whatnot? So it's good to just throw some ideas out. Hopefully it sparks some ideas and to go from there. The key thing, though, is get involved with your trade associations. So as things come across, you can make your company's position known and lobby to affect change, whether it's an offensive position to try and push forward regulations or statutes, or if it's a defensive one to block it. So,
yeah. One other thing that I'll say in closing, as you're trying to prepare your supply chain for what might happen, is be conscious of the fact that you may have gone back to your supply partners and negotiated a lower FOB cost at origin. And if these tariffs, the IEEPA tariffs in particular, get rescinded, or you now have an exclusion or an exemption of a particular type of product that's going to be imported into the United States, they are going to be aware of that, and they may attempt to claw back some of the discounts they gave you up front. Have a conversation with them so that you can be prepared, because if this burden is being alleviated, they didn't want to give away margin points to you at the beginning. So they're going to have a conversation with you of potentially clawing back some of the discounts they offered to help us mitigate the inflationary impact of some of these tariffs. So be prepared in that regard as well.
Eric, thanks, bud.
Thank you.
Outstanding. Folks, like us, share us. I hope, give us some feedback. Lalo and I are open to it. Send us email, send us comments, whatever. And also, if you don't agree with some of it, reach out to us. Maybe we're going to bring you on the show and we'll have a good discussion. Dad, I guess we need to sign off. Tell everybody to have a good day.